The Universal Academy buzzed with nervous energy as students from dozens of species filed into Xenobiology 301. Professor Zektar, a tall crystalline being from Rigel Prime, stood at the front of the lecture hall adjusting his translation matrix. His faceted form caught the artificial light, casting rainbow patterns across the walls. Marcus Chen sat in the middle row, his human eyes scanning the diverse crowd of alien students. There were the usual suspects: Velthani with their blue-scaled skin and cat-like ears, several Korgan warriors whose muscular frames barely fit in the standard seats, and a handful of ethereal minds floating in their protective spheres. What caught his attention, however, was the unusual security presence. 3 armed guards stood at strategic points around the room, their weapons clearly visible. "Today's lesson," Professor Zektar announced, his voice carrying through the translation devices worn by each student, "will be both educational and practical. We will be examining one of the galaxy's most feared predators in person." A collective murmur rippled through the classroom. The Velthani students' ears flattened against their heads while several of the more delicate species visibly trembled. Marcus noticed how the Korgan warriors straightened in their seats, hands instinctively moving toward weapons that weren't there. "I understand your concern," the professor continued, raising one of his 4 crystalline arms. "Safety protocols are in place. Our guest is secured behind quantum barriers and neural dampeners. However, I must stress that this creature represents the apex of biological warfare evolution." The main display screen flickered to life, showing a sealed containment unit being wheeled into the adjoining laboratory. Through the transparent aluminum walls, something dark and sinuous moved with predatory grace. Even through the barriers, the thing radiated an aura of deadly intent that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Behold," Professor Zektar said with academic pride, "a genuine Shadow Reaper from the Andromeda Spiral, one of only 3 specimens ever captured alive." The classroom erupted in gasps and frightened whispers. Shadow Reapers were legendary killers, spoken of in hushed tones across civilized space. They were living nightmares that could phase through solid matter, move faster than most sensors could track, and possessed an intelligence that bordered on supernatural cunning. Entire colonies had been found empty, their populations simply vanished without a trace, with only these creatures' distinctive claw marks left behind. Marcus watched as his classmates reacted with varying degrees of terror. The Velthani student next to him, Lyra, was practically hyperventilating, her blue scales shifting to a pale silver color that indicated extreme stress. Across the aisle, even the normally stoic Korgan warrior named Brutox had his massive hands clenched into fists, his breathing noticeably shallow. "Professor," called out Quintel, an ethereal mind whose sphere pulsed with agitated yellow light. "Surely this violates safety regulations? These creatures are classified as galactic-level threats. My species' homeworld fell to a pack of them 3 centuries ago." "Your concerns are noted," Professor Zektar replied calmly. "However, the University Ethics Board has approved this demonstration. The specimen is heavily sedated and contained within military-grade barriers. We are perfectly safe." As if summoned by those words, the lights in the classroom flickered. Through the laboratory's viewing window, the Shadow Reaper pressed itself against the transparent barrier, its form seeming to shift and flow like living darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were points of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb light itself. "Oh gods," whispered Lyra, her translation device struggling with her rapid, panicked breathing. "It's looking at us. It's actually looking at us." Marcus turned to study his classmate's terror-stricken face, then looked back at the creature. He had to admit it was an impressive specimen. The Shadow Reaper stood roughly 8 feet tall in its current configuration, though he knew from his reading that they could compress or extend their forms at will. Its body appeared to be made of a substance that existed somewhere between liquid and gas, constantly shifting and reforming. Occasionally, solid-looking appendages would emerge from the mass, claws that could supposedly cut through starship hulls, or tentacles that could strangle a Korgan warrior. What struck Marcus most, however, was not the creature's obvious lethality, but its intelligence. The way it moved wasn't random or animalistic. There was purpose behind every shift, every gesture. It was studying them as much as they were studying it. "The Shadow Reaper's hunting methodology," Professor Zektar continued, seemingly oblivious to his students' growing panic, involve psychological warfare as much as physical prowess. They are known to toy with their prey, feeding on fear and desperation before the final strike. The creature in the containment unit suddenly stopped moving entirely. For a moment that stretched into eternity, it simply stood motionless, its attention apparently focused on something specific. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned toward the viewing window and fixed its terrible gaze directly on Marcus. The human student felt the weight of that stare like a physical presence. Around him, other students began to notice where the creature was looking. Conversations died as heads turned in his direction. The fear in the room, already thick enough to taste, began to take on a different quality. Confusion mixed with terror. "Fascinating," Professor Zektar murmured, following the creature's gaze. "It seems to have selected a target. Tell me, Mr. Chen, are you experiencing any unusual sensations? Fear, paralysis?" Shadow Reapers are known to project psychic fields that can induce catatonic terror in most sentient species. Marcus considered the question seriously, taking mental inventory of his physical and emotional state. His heart rate was elevated slightly, but that was normal for any interesting situation. His muscles felt loose and ready, his mind clear and focused. If anything, he felt more alert than usual, the way he did when facing a challenging problem or engaging in competitive sports. "No, Professor," he replied in his characteristically calm voice. "Should I be?" The answer sent a new wave of shock through the classroom. Several students turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to awe. The Shadow Reaper, meanwhile, tilted its head in what almost looked like curiosity, its form rippling with what might have been confusion. Professor Zektar's crystalline features rearranged themselves into what his species considered a frown. In his 3 centuries of teaching, he had never encountered a student who could look upon a Shadow Reaper without experiencing at least some degree of primal terror. "Most unusual," the professor murmured, making notes on his datapad. "Most unusual indeed." The tension in the classroom reached a breaking point as Professor Zektar decided to continue the lesson, despite his students' obvious distress. The Shadow Reaper remained fixated on Marcus, its dark form pressing against the containment barrier with increasing intensity. Other students had begun moving their seats away from the human, creating a widening circle of empty space around him. "Perhaps," Professor Zektar suggested, his voice carrying a note of scientific curiosity that overrode his usual caution, "we should conduct a more detailed observation. Mr. Chen, would you be willing to move closer to the laboratory window?" "Professor, no," Lyra exclaimed, her blue scales now completely white with terror. "You can't ask him to do that. Shadow Reapers can affect minds even through barriers. They're known to drive people insane just by looking at them." Brutox, the Korgan warrior, leaned forward in his seat. Despite his species' reputation for fearlessness in battle, sweat beaded on his gray, rock-like skin. "The Veltani speaks truth, Professor. My grandfather fought these creatures during the Outer Rim Wars. He said even battle-hardened warriors would flee at the sight of them." Marcus stood up slowly, drawing sharp intakes of breath from his classmates. "I don't mind taking a closer look," he said with the same tone he might use to volunteer for reading aloud from a textbook. "It's actually quite interesting from a biological perspective." He walked down the steps toward the laboratory window, his movements calm and measured. Behind him, he could hear whispered prayers in a dozen different languages. The Shadow Reaper tracked his movement, its attention never wavering, its form beginning to pulse with what looked like anticipation. As Marcus approached the window, more details of the creature became visible. Its surface wasn't uniformly dark as it appeared from a distance. Instead, it seemed to contain swirling galaxies of deeper blackness, as if looking into the depths of space itself. Occasionally, patterns would emerge and fade, symbols or shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Remarkable," Marcus murmured, stopping just a few feet from the barrier. "The way it moves suggests a non-Newtonian fluid base, but the coherence of form indicates some kind of internal structure." "Professor, do we know anything about its biochemistry?" Professor Zektar, momentarily forgetting his students' terror in the face of genuine scientific interest, moved to join Marcus at the window. "Very little, I'm afraid. The few specimens that have been studied typically dissolve upon death, leaving behind only trace mineral deposits. This one was captured using specialized containment fields during its dormant cycle." The Shadow Reaper suddenly pressed itself flat against the barrier, its form spreading across the transparent surface like oil on water. Students throughout the classroom screamed and several fainted outright. The creature's attention, however, remained locked on Marcus, who leaned closer to get a better look. "Fascinating," he said, apparently oblivious to the chaos behind him. "Look at the way it redistributes its mass. The efficiency is incredible. Professor, what's the theoretical limit to its compression ratio?" "Mr. Chen," Professor Zektar said urgently, his scientific excitement rapidly giving way to concern, "perhaps you should step back. The readings on my instruments are unusual." Warning lights had indeed begun flashing on the containment control panel. The quantum barriers showed fluctuations that, while still well within safety parameters, were unlike anything in the historical data. The Shadow Reaper was exerting pressure against its prison in ways that defied conventional physics. Marcus tilted his head, studying the creature with the same focused attention he might give to a complex mathematical equation. "It's trying to communicate," he realized aloud. "Look at the patterns in its movement. There's structure there, repetition with variation. It's almost like..." The realization hit him just as the creature began to change. The Shadow Reaper's form started to shift, reshaping itself into something that vaguely resembled humanoid proportions. Not human exactly, but bipedal, with what might charitably be called a head and torso. It was a crude approximation, like a child's drawing brought to life, but the intent was unmistakable. "It's mimicking you," Professor Zektar whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "In 3 centuries of research, Shadow Reapers have never been observed to demonstrate imitative behavior." Behind them, Quintel's sphere pulsed with rapid yellow and red flashes. "This is beyond unprecedented," the ethereal mind transmitted through its speaker system. "Shadow Reapers are psychic entities. They don't learn, they simply hunt and kill. What we're seeing violates everything we know about their behavior patterns." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then did something that made every other person in the room question his sanity. He raised his hand and placed it flat against the barrier, directly opposite where the creature's makeshift appendage pressed against the other side. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Shadow Reaper's form solidified, becoming more defined and stable than anyone had ever seen. The swirling chaos of its surface began to organize into patterns, complex, beautiful, and somehow familiar. For a brief moment it almost looked like a star map, showing constellations that no one present recognized. "Mr. Chen," Professor Zektar said very slowly, "I think you should remove your hand from the barrier. Now." But Marcus was lost in thought, his mind racing as pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. "Professor, where exactly was this specimen captured? You mentioned it was during its dormant cycle, but Shadow Reapers don't have dormant cycles according to the literature." "The Kepler Research Station," the professor replied reluctantly. "It was found in the ruins of the outpost on Kepler 442b. The entire research team had vanished, but this creature was found in some kind of crystalline cocoon in the main laboratory." "What were they researching?" Professor Zektar hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Xenoarchaeology. They were investigating ruins of an ancient civilization. Pre-spaceflight, possibly pre-industrial." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. "Professor, I need to see the research files from that station. All of them." "That's classified information, Mr. Chen. The files are sealed by Galactic Council order." "Then unseal them," Marcus said with quiet authority. "Because I don't think this is a Shadow Reaper at all." The creature in the containment unit suddenly went completely still, its form snapping into sharp focus. For the first time since it had been captured, it looked truly alert, truly aware, and in that moment of clarity it spoke. Not through vocal cords or any physical apparatus, but directly into the minds of everyone present. The voice was like the whisper of solar wind across empty space, vast and ancient and unutterably sad. "Finally," it said, "someone who sees." The classroom erupted into chaos as students fled for the exits, but Marcus remained at the window, his hand still pressed against the barrier, staring into eyes that suddenly seemed far too human for comfort. The emergency alarms wailed throughout the Universal Academy as security teams rushed toward the xenobiology building. Marcus remained at the laboratory window, his hand still pressed against the barrier while chaos erupted around him. Most students had fled, but a few remained frozen in terror, unable to process what they had just heard. Professor Zektar's crystalline form flickered rapidly between different refractive states, a sign of extreme agitation in his species. Impossible, he kept repeating, his forearms gesturing wildly. Shadow Reapers don't speak. They don't communicate, they only kill. The creature in the containment unit had solidified further, its form now clearly humanoid despite the dark, shifting substance of its composition. It stood upright, no longer pressing against the barriers, and seemed to be waiting patiently for Marcus to respond. "You're not a Shadow Reaper," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the nearly empty classroom. "Are you?" The being shook what might have been its head. When it spoke again, its mental voice carried layers of meaning that the translation devices struggled to process. "I am what remains of Dr. Sarah Chen, xenoarchaeologist, Kepler Research Station, though I am no longer certain what that means." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stumbled backward from the window, his face going pale. Professor Zektar caught his arm, steadying him. "Mr. Chen? Do you know this name?" "Dr. Sarah Chen," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "She was my sister." The revelation sent ripples of shock through the few remaining students. Lyra, who had been too terrified to flee, now stared at Marcus with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Your sister? But that's impossible. The Kepler station incident happened 18 months ago. Everyone aboard was killed by Shadow Reapers." Marcus looked back at the contained being, his mind reeling. "Sarah, is it really you?" The creature moved closer to the barrier again, its form becoming more defined, more human-like with each passing moment. Features began to emerge from the darkness, the suggestion of a face, familiar bone structure that Marcus recognized despite the alien medium. "I remember you, little brother," the voice whispered directly into his mind. "You always were too curious for your own good, too willing to see past the surface of things." Professor Zektar was frantically checking his instruments, his scientific training warring with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "The quantum signatures are all wrong," he muttered. "This doesn't match any known Shadow Reaper patterns, but the classification, the behavior, the psychic emanations, because you only saw what you expected to see." Sarah's voice carried a note of gentle reproof. "Humans have always been good at that, seeing patterns where none exist, finding familiar shapes in chaos. It served our species well." Marcus pressed his hand against the barrier again, his earlier calm beginning to crack. "What happened to you, Sarah?" "The report said the entire station was wiped out. They found Shadow Reaper markers everywhere." "We found something," Sarah replied, her mental voice growing stronger as her form stabilized further. "In the ruins we were excavating. It wasn't a building or a city like we thought. It was a tomb." A warning. The lights in the classroom flickered again as Sarah's emotional state affected the containment field's stability. Professor Zektar nervously checked his readings, but the barriers held firm. "The civilization that built it called themselves the Harbingers," Sarah continued. "They were the first species in this galaxy to achieve faster-than-light travel. The first to spread among the stars, and they were wiped out by something they brought back from dark space. The Shadow Reapers." Brutox rumbled from his position near the back of the room. The Korgan warrior had overcome his initial terror enough to listen, though his massive frame still trembled slightly. "No," Sarah said firmly. "The Shadow Reapers were never alive in the way we understand life. They're echoes. Psychic imprints left behind by the real threat. The Harbingers created them as a warning system, a way to mark worlds that had been touched by the true darkness." Marcus felt a chill deeper than anything he had experienced before. "Then what killed the Harbingers? What's the real threat?" Sarah's form seemed to pulse with remembered fear. "We called it the hunger. It exists in the spaces between galaxies, in the void where matter grows thin and reality becomes negotiable. It feeds on consciousness itself, on the spark that makes life more than just organized chemistry." Professor Zektar looked up from his instruments with growing alarm. "Mr. Chen, the containment field is destabilizing. Your sister's emotional state is affecting the quantum matrix." But Marcus couldn't pull away. He needed to understand, needed to know what had happened to his sister and what it meant for the galaxy. "How are you here, Sarah? How are you alive?" "I'm not," she replied with heartbreaking simplicity. "Not in any way that matters. When the hunger touched our dig site, it consumed the life force of everyone on the station. But the Harbinger technology reacted to the incursion. It tried to preserve us, to turn us into warnings like the Shadow Reapers. The implications began to sink in for everyone in the room. Quintel's sphere pulsed with rapid, agitated colors as the ethereal mind processed the information. You're saying that every Shadow Reaper encounter in recorded history has been at a site where the hunger has fed, Sarah confirmed. Worlds touched by darkness where reality itself has been weakened. The Shadow Reapers aren't invaders. They're trying to warn people away from contaminated space. Professor Zektar's worst fears were being confirmed by his instruments. The containment field is failing, he announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. Whatever process is occurring, it's destabilizing the quantum barriers. Marcus looked at his sister's transformed state, seeing not a monster, but a victim of something far worse. Sarah, if the barriers fail, what happens? I don't know, she admitted. I'm still learning what I've become. But Marcus, you need to understand, the hunger is still out there. It's moving between galaxies, feeding as it goes. And it's headed toward the local group. How long do we have? Marcus asked, his tactical mind already working through the implications. Based on the astronomical data we recovered from the Harbinger sites, perhaps 50 years before it reaches the edge of the Milky Way. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. 50 years seemed like a long time to individuals. But for galactic civilization to prepare for a threat that had already consumed multiple galaxies, it was barely an instant. Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the building. Security forces could be heard approaching rapidly. Professor Zektar looked at his readings with growing horror. The barriers are cascading. We have perhaps 5 minutes before total containment failure. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of stepping back from the barrier, he moved closer. Sarah, can you maintain your form without the containment field? I don't know, she replied honestly. But if I lose cohesion, you'll lose the only source of information about what's coming. The security teams burst into the classroom just as the first of the quantum barriers collapsed. The security team entered with weapons drawn, their energy rifles charged and ready. Captain Thexmol, a battle-scarred Korgan veteran, took one look at the failing containment field and began barking orders. Clear the area. All non-essential personnel evacuate immediately. Prepare emergency containment protocols. Marcus didn't move from his position at the barrier. Captain, wait! This isn't what you think it is. Step away from the containment unit, human. Captain Thexmol roared. That creature is classified as a galactic-level threat. The moment those barriers fail, I'm authorized to use lethal force. Professor Zektar frantically tried to explain while monitoring his failing equipment. Captain, there have been developments. The entity has demonstrated unprecedented behavior. It's been communicating. I don't care if it's reciting poetry, the captain snapped. Shadow Reapers are kill on sight. No exceptions. The second barrier collapsed with a sound like breaking crystal. Sarah's form remained stable, but the psychic pressure in the room intensified dramatically. Several of the security officers staggered, their minds overwhelmed by proximity to something their instincts told them was impossibly dangerous. Sarah, Marcus called out, pressing both hands against the final barrier. Can you prove you're not a threat? Can you show them you're trying to help? Her dark form shifted, becoming more human-like than ever before. For a moment, she almost looked like the sister he remembered. Brilliant, determined, always pushing the boundaries of what was known. I can try to share what I've learned, but Marcus, you have to understand, I'm not entirely in control of what I've become. The final barrier began to flicker ominously. Captain Thexmol raised his weapon, targeting the containment unit. 30 seconds to total failure. Human, this is your last warning. Lyra, who had been frozen with terror throughout the confrontation, suddenly found her voice. Captain, what if he's right? What if we're about to destroy the only warning we have about something worse? The Velthani speaks wisdom, Brutox added, his warrior's instincts warring with his species' legendary pragmatism. If this entity truly knows of a greater threat, Quintel's sphere pulsed with urgent patterns. The psychic emanations are unlike any Shadow Reaper on record. The consciousness pattern is distinctly humanoid, showing none of the chaotic hunger typical of those creatures. Captain Thexamol hesitated, his finger on the trigger. In that moment of uncertainty, the final barrier collapsed entirely. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah's form exploded outward, no longer constrained by the quantum fields. Dark energy filled the laboratory, seeping through the walls and into the classroom beyond. But instead of the mindless aggression everyone expected, the presence that touched their minds carried only exhaustion and desperate urgency. Images flooded their consciousness, not forced upon them, but offered gently like memories shared between friends. They saw the Kepler research station as it had been, a bustling outpost full of scientists pursuing humanity's greatest passion, understanding the unknown. They felt Sarah's excitement as her team uncovered the Harbinger ruins, the growing unease as they realized what they had found, and finally the soul-crushing terror as something vast and hungry noticed their intrusion. The galaxy reeled in their shared vision, consumed not by physical destruction, but by the systematic draining of everything that made life meaningful. Worlds became empty shells, their populations reduced to hollow automatons that performed the motions of life without understanding or purpose. The hunger doesn't destroy. Sarah's voice echoed in their minds, no longer filtered through translation devices but speaking directly to their consciousness. It feeds. It leaves the infrastructure intact, the body's functioning, but it takes away everything that matters. Hope, love, curiosity, the spark that drives us to reach for the stars. Captain Thexmal lowered his weapon, his scarred face pale with understanding. How many galaxies? 17 that we found evidence of, Sarah replied. And it's accelerating. Each feeding makes it stronger, more efficient. By the time it reaches the Milky Way, it will be able to consume our entire galaxy in a matter of years. Marcus stepped forward into the dark energy that surrounded his sister, feeling no fear despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. The darkness parted around him like water, and he found himself in a pocket of calm at the center of the storm. What can we do? He asked simply. Sarah's form solidified again, the chaotic energy drawing inward until she stood before him looking almost human. Almost, but not quite. There were differences now, adaptations to her transformed state that marked her as something new. The Harbingers tried to fight it directly and failed, she said. But they left behind more than just warnings. They created weapons, tools designed to combat entities that exist partially outside normal spacetime. The problem is that these weapons require operators who can interface with technology that was never meant for organic minds. Professor Zektar, his scientific curiosity overcoming his fear, moved closer to the edge of the dark energy field. What kind of interface? Consciousness merger, Sarah replied grimly. The operator has to allow their mind to be partially integrated with systems that exist in 11 dimensions simultaneously. The Harbingers were naturally suited for this. Their neural structure was fundamentally different from any species we've encountered. But there might be alternatives. Marcus felt a chill of premonition. What kind of alternatives? Humans, Sarah said quietly. Specifically, humans who have been exposed to the Shadow Reaper transformation process, but retained enough of their original consciousness to remain functional. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Captain Thexmal voiced what they were all thinking. You're talking about deliberately creating more creatures like yourself. I'm talking about creating a defense force capable of operating weapons that might be the galaxy's only hope. Sarah corrected. But yes, it would require volunteers to undergo the same transformation I experienced. Lyra's scales had shifted to a deep purple, indicating profound thoughtfulness in her species. The psychological trauma alone would be devastating. Most minds can't handle that level of alteration and remain functional, which is why it would have to be humans, Sarah explained. Human consciousness is remarkably adaptable. You've survived everything from ice ages to space colonization by being willing to change, to become something new when circumstances demand it. Brutox rumbled thoughtfully. The human's calm behavior in the presence of what we thought was a Shadow Reaper begins to make sense. If your species is naturally resistant to the psychological effects, it's more than resistance, Marcus realized, pieces clicking into place in his mind. It's adaptation. Humans don't just survive trauma. We learn from it, integrate it, become stronger because of it. Professor Zektar was frantically taking notes on his data pad. The implications for xenopsychology are staggering, but more importantly, if this theory is correct, humanity might be the key to the galaxy's survival. Sarah nodded, her transformed features showing pride despite everything she had lost. That's why I fought so hard to maintain my consciousness when the transformation began. I knew that someone had to survive to bring this information back. I knew that humans would find a way to turn even this nightmare into hope. Marcus looked around at his classmates, his professor, the security team that had been ready to kill what they thought was a monster. All of them were looking at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror to desperate hope. "How many volunteers would you need?" he asked his sister. "Marcus, no," she said immediately. "You can't be considering." "How many?" he repeated firmly. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her dark form rippling with conflicting emotions. "To operate the Harbinger installations we've located? At least 12. Possibly more depending on how many sites remain functional after all this time." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already made up. "Then we'd better start recruiting." 3 weeks after the incident at Universal Academy, Marcus found himself in the most secure briefing room aboard the Galactic Council's flagship. Surrounded by representatives from every major species in known space, the chamber buzzed with nervous energy as holographic displays showed star maps marking confirmed Shadow Reaper sightings. Each one now understood to be a warning beacon rather than a direct threat. Admiral Kethris, the Council's chief military strategist, activated the central display with one of her 6 manipulator arms. The Centauri looked exhausted, her usually pristine blue carapace dulled with stress. "The situation is worse than we initially believed," she announced. "Deep space monitoring stations have detected gravitational anomalies at the galactic edge. Something massive is approaching from intergalactic space." Sarah stood at Marcus's side, her transformed state now familiar enough to the council members that only a few still showed visible discomfort. Her presence had been controversial. Many species representatives had initially refused to attend any meeting that included what they still considered a Shadow Reaper. It had taken direct intervention from the ethereal minds, whose psychic abilities confirmed her human consciousness, to convince them of her authenticity. "How much time do we have?" asked Ambassador Veltar of the Velthani delegation. The cat-like alien's ears were flattened against his head, a sign of deep concern. "Based on the rate of approach and the gravitational distortions," Sarah replied, her voice now transmitted through speakers rather than projected telepathically. "Approximately 18 months before the leading edge of the Hunger's influence reaches our outer systems." A collective shudder ran through the assembled representatives. 18 months to prepare for a threat that had consumed 17 galaxies. General Mordak, representing the Korgan military, leaned forward in his reinforced chair. "You mentioned Harbinger weapons installations. How many are functional?" "We've located 47 sites across the galaxy," Marcus answered, consulting his datapad. "Of those, preliminary surveys suggest that 19 are intact enough to be potentially operational. However, each installation requires a minimum of 3 human operators who have undergone the consciousness transformation. 57 volunteers minimum," Admiral Kethris calculated grimly. "How many humans have agreed to undergo the procedure?" Marcus's expression tightened. 14, including myself." The number fell into the chamber like a stone into still water. Ambassador Veltar's tail lashed with agitation. "That's less than a quarter of what you need. The transformation process is—" Marcus paused, searching for diplomatic language. "Extremely challenging. The mortality rate is approximately 60%, and even successful transformations result in fundamental alterations to human consciousness. Many volunteers have withdrawn their applications after learning the full details. What he didn't mention was the psychological screening process that had eliminated even more candidates. The transformation required not just physical resilience, but a specific type of mental flexibility that seemed to occur in less than 1% of the human population. It wasn't enough to be brave or intelligent. The candidate had to be capable of maintaining their essential self while their consciousness was fundamentally restructured. Professor Zektar, who had become the project's chief researcher, activated a secondary display showing brain scan comparisons. "The successful candidates all demonstrate unusual neural plasticity," he explained. "Their consciousness appears to be naturally suited for multi-dimensional perception. In simpler terms," Sarah added, "they're the kind of humans who could look at a Shadow Reaper and feel curiosity instead of terror." A ripple of understanding passed through the chamber. Marcus's calm reaction to what everyone thought was a deadly predator hadn't been anomalous. It had been a sign of exactly the psychological profile needed for the transformation. There must be more humans with this trait, insisted Dr. Quexnil, the ethereal mind's chief representative. The human population across the galaxy exceeds 12 billion. Statistical analysis suggests thousands of potential candidates. Marcus nodded grimly. We're conducting galaxy-wide screening now. The problem isn't finding candidates. It's convincing them to volunteer for what amounts to controlled psychological death and rebirth. Lyra, who had requested permission to attend as a witness to the original discovery, spoke up from her position in the observer gallery. Perhaps the approach is wrong. You're asking humans to sacrifice their humanity to save the galaxy. What if instead you framed it as humans becoming more than human to fulfill humanity's greatest purpose? The suggestion sparked intense discussion among the representatives. Ambassador Veltar's ears perked up with interest. Explain this concept. Humans have always defined themselves by their willingness to adapt, to become something new when necessary, Lyra continued, her scales shifting to the bright blue of inspiration. From cave dwellers to space travelers, from individuals to galactic citizens. This transformation would simply be the next step in human evolution. Sarah's dark form rippled with what might have been approval. The Velthani understands something that we've been missing. The transformation isn't a destruction of human nature. It's an expression of it. Humans don't just survive change. They seek it out, embrace it, use it to become more than they were. Admiral Kethris looked skeptical. Even if this philosophical approach increases volunteer numbers, you still face the practical problem of the transformation process itself. A 60% mortality rate is unacceptable for a military operation. We're working to improve those odds, Professor Zektar interjected. Analysis of the successful transformation suggests that preparation can significantly increase survival chances. Meditation training, consciousness expansion exercises, gradual exposure to multidimensional mathematics. All of these factors appear to improve outcomes. Marcus pulled up a new set of data on his pad. We've also identified common factors among successful candidates. They tend to be individuals who have already undergone significant psychological adaptation. Space explorers, xenopsychologists, people who have spent years interfacing with alien technologies or mindsets. That describes a significant portion of humanity's spacefaring population, General Mordak observed. Perhaps recruitment should focus on those demographics. It's already underway, Marcus confirmed. But we're fighting against time, fear, and basic survival instincts. Even humans who intellectually understand the necessity struggle with the reality of what the transformation entails. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent alert. Technical Officer Vexara, a spider-like arachnid, scuttled to the central console. Admiral, we're receiving priority transmissions from deep space monitoring stations. The gravitational anomalies are accelerating. Admiral Kethris's carapace darkened to a deep navy blue. Show me. The main display shifted to show a three-dimensional map of local galactic space. At the very edge, a spreading darkness marked the approach of something that bent space-time around itself like a lens. As they watched, the affected area visibly expanded. Revised estimates? Admiral Kethris asked tersely. Vexara's multiple eyes focused on her calculations. Based on current acceleration, first contact in 8 months. The chamber fell silent. 8 months to find, train, and transform enough humans to operate weapons they barely understood against an enemy that had conquered 17 galaxies. Marcus looked around at the assembled representatives, seeing fear, desperation, and the beginning of resignation in their expressions. But he also saw something else, hope. They were looking to humanity not just for soldiers, but for salvation. The species that had spread across the galaxy through sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitations was being asked to transcend those limitations one more time. We'll find a way, he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent chamber. It's what humans do. Sarah moved closer to her brother, her transformed presence somehow comforting despite its alien nature. The volunteers we have are already beginning their preparation. The first transformation attempts will begin within 2 weeks, and if they fail, Ambassador Veltar asked. Marcus met the alien's gaze steadily. Then we try again, and again, until we succeed or run out of time. General Mordak's scarred face creased into something that might have been a smile, spoken like a true warrior. The Korgan clans will provide whatever support you require. Similar pledges came from around the chamber as each species committed resources to humanity's desperate gambit. As the meeting broke up and representatives began planning their individual contributions to the effort, Marcus remained behind with Sarah, staring at the display showing the approaching darkness. "Do you really think we can do this?" he asked his sister. Sarah's dark form shimmered with complex emotions. "I think that if any species in the galaxy can find a way to turn an impossible situation into victory, it's humanity. The question isn't whether we can do it, it's whether we can do it fast enough." Marcus nodded, pulling up the volunteer roster on his pad, 14 names with more being added daily as word spread through human space. Each name represented someone willing to sacrifice everything they were for everything they might become. "Then we'd better get started." The transformation chamber hummed with barely contained energy deep within the research facility on Luna Station. Marcus lay on the conversion platform, neural interfaces attached to his temples, while banks of monitors tracked every aspect of his vital signs. Around him, a team of the galaxy's finest scientists worked frantically to ensure the procedure's success. 3 months had passed since the council meeting, and the recruitment drive had finally yielded enough volunteers to attempt operating the Harbinger installations. 43 humans had agreed to undergo the transformation, drawn from explorers, researchers, and the kind of individuals who had always pushed the boundaries of human experience. Marcus had insisted on being among the first subjects despite Sarah's protests. As the project leader, he felt obligated to face the same risks he was asking others to accept. More practically, his psychological profile suggested he had one of the highest chances of successful transformation. "Neural mapping complete," announced Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the lead transformation specialist. "All parameters are within acceptable ranges. Marcus, are you ready?" Through the observation window, Marcus could see Sarah's dark form pressed against the transparent barrier. Her presence had become oddly comforting over the past months as they worked together to understand the transformation process. She had been instrumental in developing the procedures that had improved survival rates from 60% to nearly 85%. "Ready," Marcus confirmed, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. Professor Zektar monitored the quantum field generators that would facilitate the consciousness transformation, initiating Phase 1, dimensional barrier reduction to 75% normal. The effect was immediate. Marcus felt his perception shift, as if someone had adjusted the focus on reality itself. Colors became more vivid, shadows gained depth and substance, and he could suddenly sense dimensions of space that his mind had never before acknowledged. "Phase 2, Dr. Tanaka announced. Consciousness expansion to multidimensional awareness." This phase was harder. Marcus felt his mind stretching, reaching into spaces that didn't exist in normal three-dimensional reality. It was like learning to see with new senses, to think thoughts that required more than standard neural pathways. Several volunteers had failed at this stage, their consciousness snapping back to normal parameters like an overstretched rubber band. But Marcus held on, his natural curiosity overriding the instinctive terror of his expanding awareness. Through the observation window, he could see not just Sarah's physical form but the complex energy patterns that made up her transformed consciousness. She was beautiful in ways that human language couldn't describe. "Phase 3, Professor Zektar called out. Consciousness integration with shadow matter matrix." This was the critical moment, the point where most failures occurred. Marcus felt something vast and alien touch his mind, offering to merge with his consciousness. It was the same type of energy that comprised Sarah's new form, the transformed matter that existed partially outside normal space-time. Instead of fighting the integration, Marcus embraced it. He thought of Sarah's words about human adaptability, about their species' gift for becoming something new when circumstances demanded it. The alien energy flowed through his consciousness like water finding its level, reshaping his awareness without destroying its essential nature. Warning alarms began sounding as his vital signs fluctuated wildly. Dr. Tanaka's hands flew over her controls, making real-time adjustments to keep the process stable. Cardiac stress increasing, neural activity spiking beyond safe parameters. "Hold the course," Marcus managed to say, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. "I can handle it." And he could. Where other volunteers had been overwhelmed by the alien nature of the transformation, Marcus found himself fascinated by it. His consciousness was becoming something new, something that could perceive and interact with realities that normal human minds couldn't even imagine. It was the ultimate expression of human curiosity, the willingness to become alien to themselves in pursuit of understanding. Transformation reaching completion phase, Professor Zektar announced with barely contained excitement. All readings are stable. This is remarkable. Marcus felt the final changes settle into place. His consciousness now existed on multiple, dimensional levels simultaneously, able to perceive the universe as the Harbingers had intended their weapon operators to see it. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands, which appeared normal but cast shadows that moved independently and seemed to extend into spaces that weren't there. "How do you feel?" Dr. Tanaka asked, her instruments showing readings that were unprecedented in their stability. Marcus sat up slowly, testing his new perceptions. The room looked the same but infinitely more complex. He could see the quantum interactions between particles, the probability fields that determined reality, the subtle dimensional stresses that the approaching hunger was already creating at the galactic edge. "Different," he said honestly, "but still myself, still human, just more." Sarah's relief was palpable through the observation window. Through his transformed consciousness, Marcus could perceive her emotional state directly: joy, pride, and a deep sense of vindication that the process could preserve human identity while enabling the necessary changes. "The test will be whether you can interface with Harbinger technology," Professor Zektar reminded them. "We've prepared a preliminary connection to one of the smaller artifacts." A section of the chamber wall slid away, revealing a device that hurt to look at directly. It was clearly artificial but constructed according to principles that normal human perception couldn't fully grasp. With his transformed awareness, however, Marcus could see its elegant complexity, the way it existed across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. He approached the artifact cautiously, extending his consciousness toward it. The moment contact was established, information flooded his mind. Technical specifications, operational procedures, and a deep understanding of the weapon's capabilities. It was designed to disrupt the hunger's feeding process, to create dimensional barriers that could protect entire star systems from consciousness drain. "It works," he said with quiet amazement. "I can operate it. More than that, I understand it. The Harbingers built these weapons to be intuitive for consciousness like mine." Dr. Tanaka was frantically recording data, while Professor Zektar began planning the next phase of transformations. But Marcus barely noticed their excitement. Through his connection to the Harbinger artifact, he had gained access to their database of the Hunger's movements. What he saw there filled him with both hope and dread. The good news was that the weapons could work. The Harbingers had developed effective countermeasures against the Hunger's assault on consciousness. The bad news was that they had ultimately failed, not because their weapons were inadequate, but because they hadn't been able to deploy enough of them fast enough. "How many installations will we need to protect the entire galaxy?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from the Harbinger records. Professor Zektar consulted his calculations. Minimum effective coverage requires at least 35 active installations, with a full crew of 3 operators each. 105 transformed humans, Marcus said grimly. "We have 42 volunteers remaining, and 6 weeks before the Hunger's vanguard reaches our outer systems." The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. Even with improved transformation procedures, they couldn't possibly train and transform enough operators in time to protect more than a fraction of galactic civilization. Unless they found another way. Marcus looked at the Harbinger artifact. Its impossible geometry now as familiar to him as his own reflection. Through his transformed consciousness, he could perceive possibilities that normal human awareness couldn't access. The weapons could be networked, their effectiveness multiplied through quantum entanglement across galactic distances. "We can't protect everything," he realized aloud. "But we might be able to protect enough." Sarah's form brightened with understanding. Through their shared consciousness interface, she grasped his plan immediately. A strategic defense. Protect key worlds. population centers, manufacturing hubs. Let the hunger consume the empty spaces while we preserve the core of galactic civilization. It wasn't a perfect solution. Billions would be lost, entire worlds abandoned to an enemy that left only hollow shells behind. But it was survivable, which was more than any previous galaxy had managed. Marcus turned to address the assembled scientists and observers. Change of plans. We're not trying to save everything. We're trying to save enough to rebuild when this is over. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Professor Zektar was the first to speak. A triage approach to galactic defense, morally horrifying but mathematically sound. The Korgan clans will not abandon their worlds without a fight, came General Mordak's voice through the communication system. They won't have to, Marcus replied, his transformed consciousness already calculating optimal defensive positions. Some worlds can be defended with minimal resources. Others will require evacuation, and some. He paused, the weight of command settling on his shoulders. Some will have to be sacrificed. The hunger arrived 3 days ahead of schedule. Marcus felt it first through his transformed consciousness. A wrongness at the edge of perception, like hearing a discordant note in a symphony. He was deep within Harbinger Installation 7, one of 23 defensive positions they had managed to activate across the galaxy. Around him, the impossible architecture of the ancient weapon hummed with potential energy, waiting for his command. Contact, he announced through the quantum communication network that linked all active installations. Leading edge of the hunger's influence has reached the outer rim, initiating defensive protocols. Across the galaxy, 37 other transformed humans acknowledged his transmission. They had managed to transform only 38 volunteers in total, far fewer than optimal, but enough to operate the most critical installations. The mortality rate had ultimately stabilized at 15%, a vast improvement over the early attempts, but still heartbreakingly high for those who knew the volunteers personally. Through the installation's sensors, Marcus could perceive the hunger's approach in ways that normal technology couldn't detect. It moved like a wave of absolute emptiness, not destroying matter but draining it of meaning. Stars continued to burn, planets continued to orbit, but the consciousness that gave significance to these phenomena simply ceased. Installation 12 reports first contact, came Dr. Elena Vasquez's voice through the network. She had been among the last to volunteer, a xenopsychologist who had spent decades studying how different species perceived reality. The effect is exactly as predicted. Physical structures remain intact, but all higher brain functions in organic beings are shutting down. Marcus activated the Installation 7's primary defense grid. The weapon didn't fire energy or projectiles in any conventional sense. Instead, it created what the Harbingers had called a consciousness anchor, a stabilized field of awareness that could resist the hunger's draining effects. The process was exhausting. Marcus felt his transformed consciousness stretch across dimensional barriers, holding reality stable through sheer force of will. Around the installation, space itself seemed to solidify, becoming more real, more defined than the gray emptiness that surrounded it. Anchor established, he reported. Installation 7 is holding. Area of effect approximately 50,000 cubic kilometers. Similar reports came in from installations across the galaxy. Each successful activation created a bubble of protected space, islands of consciousness in a growing sea of emptiness. But Marcus could see through the network's shared awareness that they were fighting a losing battle. The hunger was vast beyond imagination, and their defenses covered only a tiny fraction of galactic space. Installation 22 is failing, came a strained voice, Lieutenant Commander James Park, a former space explorer who had volunteered despite having a wife and 2 children. I can't maintain the anchor. The hunger is too strong here. Marcus reached out through the network, adding his own consciousness to Park's struggle. Other operators did the same, their combined awareness flowing across impossible distances to reinforce the failing installation. It was like trying to hold back an ocean with their bare hands, but somehow they managed to stabilize the anchor. Thank you, Park gasped. Whatever you just did, it's working. Installation 22 is stable. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The installations weren't meant to operate independently. They were designed to function as a network, their operators sharing the burden of maintaining reality against the hunger's assault. The Harbingers had understood something that his team had missed. Consciousness itself was the weapon, and the more conscious minds working together, the stronger the defense became. All installations, implement network protocol, Marcus commanded. Link your consciousness anchors to the primary grid. We're stronger together than apart. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Instead of 38 isolated bubbles of protected space, the installations became nodes in a vast web of stabilized reality. The network's total coverage expanded exponentially as the combined consciousness of the operators reinforced each other. Sarah's voice reached him through a private channel, her transformed awareness touching his across the dimensional barriers. Marcus, the network is working, but there's something else. The hunger isn't just draining consciousness, it's learning from it. It's adapting to our defenses. Marcus felt it too, a subtle shift in the enemy's approach. Where the hunger's initial assault had been crude and overwhelming, it was now beginning to probe the network's weaknesses, testing different approaches to breach their defenses. All operators be advised, he transmitted. The enemy is showing adaptive behavior. Maintain vigilance and report any unusual phenomena. The response was immediate and alarming. Installation after installation reported changes in the hunger's assault pattern. It was no longer simply draining consciousness, but actively trying to corrupt it, turning the operator's own awareness against them. Installation 15 under heavy assault, reported Dr. Sarah Kim, a neuroscientist who had studied consciousness transfer. Something is trying to invade my awareness. It feels like it's pretending to be human thoughts. Marcus reached out through the network to examine Installation 15's situation. What he found there made his transformed consciousness recoil in horror. The hunger had learned to mimic human thought patterns, creating false memories and emotions that felt completely authentic. Dr. Kim was fighting not just to maintain her anchor, but to preserve her own identity against an enemy that was trying to replace her consciousness with something else entirely. Network Protocol 7, Marcus ordered. All operators implement identity verification procedures. The enemy is attempting consciousness infiltration. The identity verification protocols were something they had developed during training, mental exercises that confirmed an operator's authentic consciousness by requiring them to access memories and thought patterns that only they could know. It was their last line of defense against an enemy that could potentially turn their own minds against them. But even as the operators successfully repelled the infiltration attempts, Marcus realized they were facing a fundamental problem. The hunger was learning faster than they could adapt. Each defensive success taught it new ways to attack, and its vast consciousness could process and integrate these lessons at a rate that human minds couldn't match. Sarah, he called through their private channel, we're fighting a losing battle. Every time we successfully defend, we're teaching it how to attack more effectively. I know, she replied, her consciousness touching his with a mixture of pride and sorrow. But Marcus, look at what you've accomplished. 23 star systems are still free. Billions of people are alive and aware because of what you and the other operators are doing. Marcus expanded his awareness through the network, perceiving the protected zones scattered across the galaxy. Each installation anchored a bubble of normal space-time where consciousness continued to exist, where civilizations could survive and potentially rebuild. It wasn't victory in any conventional sense, but it was survival. How long can we maintain this? He asked. Unknown, Sarah admitted. The Harbinger's record suggests that their operators lasted approximately 18 months before the strain became too much. But they were operating under different conditions with different technology. 18 months. Marcus considered the time frame while maintaining his part of the network's defenses. 18 months to find a permanent solution, to develop new weapons or strategies that could drive back the hunger entirely. 18 months for the protected populations to prepare for whatever came next. All operators, he transmitted across the network. New mission parameters. We're not trying to defeat the enemy, we're buying time. Hold the line, protect what we can, and give our people a chance to find a better solution. The acknowledgements came back from across the galaxy. 37 other transformed humans who had given up their original selves to become something new, something capable of standing against an enemy that had consumed 17 galaxies. They were no longer entirely human, but they were still driven by the most human of motivations, the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Marcus settled into his command position. His consciousness spread across dimensional barriers he couldn't have imagined before his transformation. Around him, the Harbinger installation hummed with ancient power, holding a fragment of reality stable against the endless gray emptiness that surrounded it. He thought of his sister, of the students who had fled in terror from what they thought was a monster, of the galaxy full of diverse species who were counting on humanity to find a way through the darkness. They had become something new to meet this threat, not quite human anymore, but carrying forward everything that made humanity worth preserving. The hunger pressed against their defenses with infinite patience and growing cunning, but the network held, consciousness anchored against the void, buying precious time for a galaxy that refused to surrender without a fight. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for, but it was a beginning. And as Marcus had learned long ago in a xenobiology classroom, sometimes staying calm in the face of a killer was the first step toward